Hello, this is Professor Young, and this is part 2 of our look into the female reproductive system. During this session, we will focus strictly on the menstrual cycle. So, where we left off was really looking at the maturity of the egg, of the follicle, going from that secondary follicular stage, where it gets arrested at the end of meiosis 1, that 13-year pause, give or take a few years, and then at the onset of puberty and the onset of the menstrual cycle, moving from the secondary follicle into a tertiary follicle, reaching that Graafian phase, that Graafian follicle, and eventually leading to ovulation. And so that is where we pick up here. What exactly is happening that is going to allow ovulation to occur? And we already kind of know the key players that we're going to be dealing with here during this session. We already know that luteinizing hormone is going to be a key factor here. We already know that follicle stimulating hormone is going to be a key factor. We already know that the estradiol is going to be a key factor. And we already know that progesterone is going to be a key factor. But how do these four hormones, two of which, remember, are produced within the anterior pituitary, and the other two are produced through the ovaries, and more specifically, within those follicles that are developing. How do these four hormones, released and produced in two totally opposite ends of the body, come together to regulate the whole menstrual cycle? And what is the menstrual cycle? I mean, we kind of have a sense of what it is, but what's really happening during this 28 to 35 day cycle that all females go through? And so that's what we're going to be looking at here during this phase. The first thing we need to consider here is, first of all, what is, if you would, ovulation, and how does it pertain to that of humans? Humans are what we refer to as being spontaneous ovulators. That means that on a monthly cycle, we will automatically ovulate. Not all mammals follow a monthly cycle of ovulation. Most mammals, almost all other mammals, enter into what we refer to as being a period of estrus. And what estrus is it is a seasonal ovulation period. In other words, deer, they go through an estrus period during the fall. All right. Most mammals are going to go through an estrus period during the spring and then have their young sometime in the late spring, early summer. All right. Humans don't do that. We don't have a seasonal mating season, if you would. Every month, females will go through this concept of ovulation. Now, how does that play into this whole concept of the hormone levels? And that's really what we want to look at here and spend some time on during this session. Literally, a female's length of cycle will vary throughout age. In other words, between 15 and 19 years old, you typically have a little less regularity of that cycle, and typically it takes a little bit longer to get through that cycle, about 35 days. Once you hit your 30s, typically that drops down to about 30 days. 35 years to 40, you're looking at about 28-day cycles. And so on average, we say it's about a 29.5-day cycle by which we count this or break down this menstrual cycle. There is a lot of variations. A lot of things will impact the overall length. right? Diet, health, age, stress, um, uh, exercise will play a role into how regular or not so regular the menstrual cycle will be. And there's a whole host of other things that we won't get into, but that also play into it. These are the five major factors that need to be considered when you look at the menstrual cycle. Now, overall, we can break down the menstrual cycle into three distinct phases, and they are in order as we like to think of them happening. Because this is a cycle, keep in mind there is no real true beginning or end to this. With that said, we're going to start it at the time of menstruation. In other words, at the time of sloughing off that outer lining, that stratum functionalis, if you would, and then move through the release of the egg known as ovulation. And so if we look at this cycle in that term, from the sloughing of the endometrium down through the release of an egg through ovulation, then we say that the menstrual cycle or menstruation happens in three distinct orders or three distinct phases. The menstrual phase, which again is considered to be the beginning of the cycle, lasts anywhere from 1 to 7 days on average, 1 to 6 days depending on the individual. Again, this is characterized by the sloughing off of the endometrium, right? Specifically the stratum functionalis. When we talk about the sloughing off of the endometrium, we're specifically looking at the stratum functionalis. All right? And we're going to talk about what happens with that. Why is it that we get rid of this thickened layer of tissue lining the cervix? We'll talk about that. Once or as we are sloughing off, if you would, the stratum functionalis, the follicular phase kind of begins and then goes into on its own being the main show or the main act of the show known as menstruation. During the follicular phase, this is where we have the maturing of the secondary follicles into the tertiary follicle. In other words, the follicular phase is all about getting that egg and its follicle to the Graafian follicle stage so that the egg can be released. Release is not included in the follicular phase. The release of the egg from the Graafian follicle is what is going to occur during the luteal phase. That is where we see ovulation. And again, ovulation being the release of the egg. Now notice we have our good old friends back. Corpus luteum is back in the picture. Estradiol is back in the picture. Progesterone is back in the picture. Estradiol, aka estrogen, and progesterone are going to be directly responsible for the regulation of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And this is where we really get into our negative feedbacks and positive feedback systems that we've mentioned during lecture. So these are the three phases. Now, what we need to do is we need to spend a little bit of time going through each of these phases and really looking at what is happening in detail. Our focus is no longer on the follicle. For the menstruation cycle, our focus is now shifting to hormone interactions. What are the hormones doing, and how are the hormones directing the process of ovulation? This here is just a pretty little picture that kind of shows a breakdown of the menstrual cycle. You can see that after ovulation, that's the big bulk of the phase. Typically, the luteal phase is taking up about 14 or so days of the overall cycle. About half of the cycle is found within the luteal phase. That's ovulation, potential fertilization, traveling through the oviducts, and hopefully landing into that cervix, landing into the uterus, where if fertilized, it will attach. If not fertilized, then we begin the menstrual phase, which would be the sloughing off of the stratum functionalis. Let me throw something out here, because you got to be good at multitasking when you're talking about some of these phases. If the egg is fertilized, then we do not go into the menstrual phase. The menstrual phase is characterized by the release, the sloughing off of the stratum functionalis. That does not happen if the egg is fertilized. If the egg is fertilized, then we go right into pregnancy. And so the whole menstrual cycle kind of ceases to exist as long as the female is pregnant. So don't lose sight of that. We're talking about this as one complete cycle that kind of happens over and over again, but there is an interruption to the cycle, right? And that's called pregnancy, and that is only going to occur if the egg has been fertilized within the oviducts. All right, so with that caveat in place, let's go through and begin looking at the menstrual phase. Again, the menstrual phase is characterized by a sloughing off or a removing of the stratum functionalis. Remember that during the tertiary follicle development, estrogen and progesterone are being released. And these hormones, along with the corpus luteum, are increasing the thickness of the stratum functionalis. We're adding tissue to it. Blood supply is happening at the stratum bacillus layer. It's still within the endometrium, but it's the deep layer where we have all the blood vessels. And what ends up happening is, during the menstrual phase, assuming that the egg is not fertilized and we begin the sloughing off of the stratum functionalis, what causes the sloughing off of the stratum functionalis is a lack of blood supply. So what happens is, about 4 days before the menstrual phase begins, the egg has been released, ovulation has occurred, and within those 4 days, if the egg has not been fertilized, then the corpus luteum dissolves itself. It breaks down. As it breaks down, it stops the release of estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone, a lack of estrogen and progesterone, specifically a lack of the estradiol, a lack of the estrogen, is going to lead to vasoconstriction. It's going to lead to vasoconstriction. In other words, I can't click on the right thing. In other words, what we mean by this is the blood vessels that are found very heavy and thick within the stratum bacillus close off. And we cut off blood supply now to the stratum functionalis. That lack of blood supply going to the stratum functionalis is what causes the ischemia. It's what causes that tissue to die off and then gotten rid of. Now, where does all the blood come from? Well, you've removed the stratum functionalis. You've now severed and exposed all of those blood vessels that are within the stratum bacillus. And that's where the blood begins to come into play. As the stratum functionalis reconfigures itself, as those cells are replaced, the bleeding stops. Because now you've reconcealed, if you would, or you've blocked off that blood supply within the uterus. And so the blood that associated with the menstrual flow is there because of the sloughing off of the stratum functionalis. You've exposed the underlying blood vessels associated with the stratum bacillus. And so that's where all of that's coming from. When we talk about menstrual flow, we're talking about not only the blood from the stratum bacillus, but we're talking about the lining, and we're talking about additional cells from the cervix and the vagina as well, and secretions. And so you get a lot of things that get incorporated into that menstrual flow. While the menstrual phase is happening, the follicular phase is beginning to fire up. Hormone levels have dropped. Estradiol has dropped, and progesterone levels have dropped. And as we will talk about, what this leads to is an increase in LH and FSH. It leads to an increase in luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. LH and FSH have direct impact on secondary follicles. It's what initiates the beginning, the reconstitution, if you would, or reinitiation of meiosis 1. A drop in estrogen and progesterone leads to an increase in LH and FSH, which allows your secondary follicles to initiate the process of becoming tertiary follicles, leading to the Graafian follicle. That's all happening towards the end of the menstrual phase. And so while the menstrual phase is happening, your follicular phase is beginning to fire up. This diagram that is before you really explains everything that is going on. I could technically have a one-slide PowerPoint on this, just showing that picture, and that explains everything. Make sure, as you're going through your notes, and as you're looking at the diagrams, and as you're listening to this session, that you can relate what I'm talking to that is in front of you. What you are looking at, just to make sure that everybody is clear. This line right here is basically representing the menstrual phase. This line right there is basically representing the follicular phase. And this line right there is basically representing the luteal phase. And so they are your three phases represented in this diagram. You can see underneath that the corresponding actions happening within the follicle development as well. Right, so your follicular development is outlined right here as far as what's happening during each of the phases. Again, don't lose sight of this. Luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, as it increases, it's going to be acting on the follicular phase. It's going to be causing follicle size increase. It's going to allow for the expansion and the growth and the development of the follicle. Your thecal cells become more thicker, more dense. Your oocyte enlarges. You create that anstrom, remember, which is the nutrient supply for the developing oocyte. As the follicle size increases, you increase the release of estrogen. Estrogen acts directly on the hypothalamus to release gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which is then also going to act on the anterior pituitary, spiking the levels of luteinizing hormone. So estradiol is going to cause a rapid and sharp increase in the release of luteinizing. Why? Because you want that egg to develop. You want the follicle to continue to enlarge in size. Luteinizing hormone is directly responsible for the increase of follicular development. Luteinizing hormone is directly responsible for the development of that follicle, moving it from a secondary follicle to a tertiary follicle and through the phases of being a tertiary follicle until it reaches the Graafian follicle size. Notice that progesterone levels are remaining low. If you look at this bottom line right here. By the way, this is where we are. We're looking right here. We're looking right there as far as what's happening and what's going on. We're looking at that purple area. If you look at the bottom diagram, the green right there, that's progesterone. It's rock bottom. It's rock bottom not only during the menstrual phase, but it's rock bottom even through the follicular phase. Progesterone doesn't come into its own being until you get into the luteal phase, and that's because of its role during uterine support, uterine preparation to hopefully receive that fertilized egg. Again, follow along what's going on here, because you can tell that there's going to be a direct link between progesterone and what is happening during follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. As progesterone levels increase, it's going to cause a negative feedback on LH and FSH, and it's going to block them. It's going to inhibit them, which is going to inhibit the development of the follicle if the released oocyte has been fertilized. All right, let's continue. Let's look at the follicular phase. All right, we already talked about this as well a little bit. We know that the follicular phase is characterized by follicular growth. The tertiary follicle is going to continue to enlarge in size. The thecal cells become more defined. The anstrom grows. The oocyte itself is going to grow. Once one of those tertiary follicles has reached the phase or the size of the Graafian follicle, and remember, what determines the race of the Graafian follicle is the amount of FSH that accumulates within that Graafian follicle, within that tertiary follicle. The tertiary follicle that accumulates the highest level of FSH is going to be the follicle that is going to release the oocyte. Everything else, all the other tertiary follicles, switch over to releasing estradiol. It releases the estrogen. Why? To thicken up stratum functionalis. It wants to thicken that endometrial lining in preparation for ovulation. The body doesn't know if it's going to actually receive a fertilized egg, but it's got to be ready nevertheless. Because if it's not ready, the egg has no chance of attaching and adhering to the wall of the uterus, which means pregnancy isn't going to happen. Notice that estradiol levels continue to increase, which is going to cause a surge in luteinizing hormone. Why? Why does estradiol cause a rise in luteinizing hormone? Remember, estrogen, is causing a thickening of the uterine lining. But it's got to ensure that the egg is also ready for release. And the way that estrogen is going to ensure that the tertiary follicle, the Graafian follicle, is ready to release and ovulate that egg is by increasing the release of luteinizing hormone. And what we actually, I'll take it a step further. Check this out. And this is where it gets very complicated. Estradiol leads to an increase in luteinizing hormone. But, the big but, estradiol leads to negative inhibition of follicle stimulating hormone. In other words, through a negative feedback system, it inhibits the release of follicle stimulating hormone, but it has a positive feedback effect on lutein hormone. Estradiol is released from the Graafian follicle to thicken the lining of the endometrium. It increases the thickness of the stratum functionalis. It increases the level of luteinizing hormone to guarantee that the oocyte will be ovulated and that it is the maximum size that it can be. Positive feedback. At the same time, it's going to inhibit the release of follicle stimulating hormone. Why? You don't want any more follicles developing. You've got your Graafian follicle. You've got the selected follicle that is going to ovulate in that one particular ovary. You don't need any more follicles to develop. You don't need any more secondary follicles to go and enter into tertiary follicles. And so estrogen blocks it. Estradiol has a negative feedback on follicle stimulating hormone during the follicular phase. I'll say it again. Estradiol has a negative feedback on follicle stimulating hormone during the follicular phase because we don't want any more follicles developing. But it has a positive feedback. It enhances, increases, surges the release of luteinizing hormone because we want to concentrate all that energy on making sure that the Graafian follicle is ready for release and ovulation as soon as the stratum functionalis is thickened. And if you need to, rewind, play again. Rewind, play again. Rewind, play again. And if you still need to, rewind again. If you have the ability to slow everything down, you can slow down the words and then, it'll kind of sound like estrogen leads to. All right, so do whatever you need to do, but make sure you understand that basic relationship between estradiol or estrogen and luteinizing hormone and estrogen and follicle stimulating hormone. Do not click on another slide. Do not go any further in this presentation if you don't have that down. And I think I've already beaten this one into you well enough. Right? A rise in luteinizing hormone leads to ovulation. We are now ready for ovulation. The egg is now ready to release. And here's what we see. Right before ovulation occurs, we see a rise in progesterone. What causes the rise in progesterone? The rise in luteinizing hormone. Estradiol causes the rise in luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone prepares the Graafian follicle for ovulation. Right before ovulation happens, the increase in lutein hormone causes an increase in progesterone. I'm letting that sink in before I go any further. All right, let's move on. Again, here's the exact same diagram that we've looked at. And you can see, if you look at this area, right there, here is the increase in luteinizing hormone, which is beginning to lead to the increase in progesterone. At the same time, here's that drop-off of estradiol. There's the drop-off of estrogen. The other thing I will point out is the increase of estrogen, or estradiol, has led to the inhibition of follicle-stimulating hormone. Notice this is all happening towards the end of the follicular phase and the beginning of the luteal phase. Remember, the luteal phase is all about ovulation. It's all about ovulation. All right? And so as we enter into ovulation, because of the increased levels of progesterone and estrogen, the endometrium becomes even thicker. The corpus luteum now switches over. Ovulation has occurred. The Graafian follicle has released the egg, and we're now left basically with scar tissue, the corpus luteum. It's the remnants of that Graafian follicle. And the job of that corpus luteum is to secrete estrogen and progesterone. Now, if no fertilization occurs, then the corpus luteum dissolves. And the key here is this happens about, no, I'm not going to say that. Never mind. All right. If no fertilization occurs and the corpus luteum dissolves, think about what that means. If the corpus luteum is secreting estradiol and progesterone, we already know that estradiol is going to block FSH. Progesterone levels, they've got a role in that they inhibit luteinizing hormone. So if fertilization occurs, the corpus luteum remains. Estrogen is secreted, which is going to further inhibit follicle-stimulating hormone. Progesterone now is going to override estradiol, and it's going to inhibit luteinizing hormone. What does that do? That prevents the follicular phase from happening. It also prevents the menstrual phase from happening. high levels of estrogen and progesterone inhibit the menstrual phase. High levels of estrogen and progesterone inhibit the menstrual phase. High levels of estrogen and progesterone inhibits the menstrual phase. No sloughing off of the uterine lining. No sloughing off of the endometrium. No more further development of secondary follicles into tertiary follicles. All the care is given to the stratum functionalis. And if you look, again, you can see that exact same mechanism here. Here we are. Luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormones are low, right, very low, right, whereas progesterone in particular is high. Estradiol is just high enough to block follicle stimulating hormone. Progesterone levels have spiked their way up to block luteinizing hormone and to ensure the integrity of the stratum functionalis. And for those of you that are looking for another way of looking at this, here's everything. This is everything that I have spent the last, I don't know how many minutes discussing, all summarized into one nice, neat little layer. Right, here, again, during the luteal phase, if you look at this here, you can see a thickening of the stratum functionalis, indicating that at the luteal phase, all right, right before the menstrual phase, which is right there. That's the thinning out and the sloughing off of the stratum functionalis. Now, looking at that, move your way upward. As we have a thickening of the stratum functionalis or the endometrium, what's happening to hormone levels released from within the follicle? What's happening to hormone levels being released from the anterior pituitary? What's happening to follicular development? You should be able to look at that picture, go back, rewind, listen to everything that I've just gone through, and relate this all to one another. And on that note, I will leave you your study and review. As always, if you have any questions, make sure you ask. I always ask. Never leave a question unanswered. That is how I will trick you up. So I cannot stress that enough. And at this point in time, we are finished AMP2 information. And as always, happy studying, and we'll see you.